Oh, sir, ma'am,
Yes, sir.
please start the session.
A very good morning to all. Honorable Speaker Dr. Hanif Sheikh Sir, Medicine Sans Frontiers, Doctors Without Borders, and TB Trials National Coordinator. Respected Principal Dr. G.S. Talile Sir, coordinators of today's webinar, Mr. Prashant Chauhan Sir, Mr. Sachin Kapse Sir, and Mr. Prashant Vivare Sir, all the staff members, and all our valued invited participants. Welcome. I, Shraddha Bhavsar, Assistant Professor, Matushri College of Pharmacy, welcome you all in this today's webinar. Today, we are presenting current scenario in clinical research in India by our eminent speaker, Dr. Hanif Sheikh Sir. Before starting the session, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Hanif Sheikh Sir is a clinical research professional and academician with 14 years experience with national and international organization in clinical development and regulatory. His main work is in clinical development of conjugated meningitis vaccine, measles aerosol vaccine, oral rotavirus vaccine, pneumococcal vaccine, typhoid conjugated vaccine. His areas of interest are vaccine clinical development, maternal immunization, antimicrobial resistance, and research in tuberculosis. Currently, he works with MSF, an international humanitarian organization, as a national coordinator, clinical trials. He worked as high caliber investigator, a DBT CDSA sponsored fellowship in clinical research and secretary, ethics committee at KEM Hospital Research Center. In 2016, he was selected for highly reputed World Health Organization fellowship in clinical research and worked as a consultant clinical development at International Vaccine Institute, South Korea. He is working for strengthening clinical research capacities in India and has been instrumental in developing training programs in vaccinology and clinical research for researchers working in low and middle income countries. He has many publications in national and international journals. He is an active member of various international research networks like Imprint, Validate, RSTHM, Vectivac, HiVac, etc. And he has guided many MPharm, MBA, and MTech students for their research projects. So this was a short introduction about our speaker. Now, just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your YouTube or Zoom control panel. We will bring them up at the end of the session. So now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our speaker. Please, sir.
Well, thank you very much for such a nice and lucid introduction. I was feeling that I am hearing for someone other who's not me. But anyway, that's a great introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me for this webinar. It's always a really great experience talking with the pharmacy professional, particularly pharma students, faculties, and a professional who are working in this pharmaceutical industry as a whole. Okay, so I'll start with my slides, but before that, I just wanted to share one story with you that is about the clinical trials. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
And can you see my screen as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so since Matoshri College have been organizing various workshops, various seminars on the clinical research, and you might have gone through at least superficially what is a clinical research is all about. But there is one interesting story about the clinical trials, because before that there were so many medical practices and people used to treat the patient without really assessing the patient treatment outcome and those could be considered as their really medical practices, but there was no proper research. But recently, on 20th May, we have celebrated the International Clinical Trial Day in the names of Dr. James Lind, who actually uh, conducted one small clinical trials on a scurvy patient. So James Lind, who was a physician in UK, uh, he observed that there are few cases on some sheep which are of scurvy, and people are really suffering a lot because of scurvy and also dying. So they have typical putrid gums, spot, and lassitude, which weakens of the knees. And these cases were quite severe on the sealer. So he thought, why should not we do something different? So he identified such 12 scurvy cases, and then two of them were ordered a quart of cider a day. Like he formed the different groups, like two in each group, and then the other two took the spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times a day, and two of the worst patient were put on the other course of water, and they typically two were given oranges and lemons. So he observed the different groups of the people, the different sailors who were given a different kind of treatment or different kind of oral administration. And he noticed that the people who were on the oranges and the lemon have better recovery rate. So that was a kind of first controlled clinical trial where the people, the sailor get the different treatments, and he actually matches the outcome with the different groups. So from that time, the clinical trial is considered as a basic, really methodological sciences. Okay, so from then the clinical trial, the randomized clinical trial, there are different designing. Like recently, we're talking about the adaptive clinical trials and all clinical trials who actually made it in a systematic way. So coming back to India, when we talk about the India, we have. I'm sorry, this is something wrong with it. Okay, anyway, can you see my screen, everyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So when we talk about India, we always consider ourselves as lucky because of certain reasons that clinical industry is booming in India. There are a lot of clinical trials professional now developing their career in clinical research. So what is the current status of clinical trial in India, and what are the challenges, particular regulatory challenges, the capacity challenges when you talk about clinical research in India? So in my next 1 hour presentation, I will take you through the disease conditions in India, the India's potential for clinical research, what are the regulatory changes happening in last few decades, and recently there is one rule published by the CDSCO, that is New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules 2019, and what are the different approvals and registration required when we want to conduct clinical trial here in India. I will also talk about the potential capacity gaps in academic clinical research and what is the way forward when you want to, as a pharmacy institute or a medical institute, want to participate in trial related activities. So that is the content of my presentation. Talking about disease conditions in India, so the top 10 causes of death in India are mainly like a tuberculosis, coronary heart disease, lung disease, low birth weight, stroke, influenza, diarrheal disease, kidney disease, and liver diseases. You name any disease and you'll find all the cases in here in India. We have a really huge pool of the patient in India, but these are the top 10 causes of death. Apart from that, there are so other illnesses which not necessarily include the infectious diseases, but also non-infectious diseases, like which are basically related to your lifestyle, are non-communicable diseases as well as communicable diseases. Okay, so because of this different kind of the diseases, we have very high potential in healthcare industry. So if you see the healthcare industry contribution or the status, the recent contribution, we have high demand. That is, in the healthcare market, India is expected to reach almost 372 billion by 2022. Okay, that is mainly because of rising concern of the patients towards the healthcare awareness, their lifestyle changes. Then another concern is a kind of insurance facilities. So people are tending towards getting a healthcare. So their healthcare seeking behavior is quite improved in last few years. There are certain other attractive opportunities, like the hospital industry. India is expected to grow to almost 16 to 70%. That is almost more than 120.84 billion dollar by 2022. In the last just couple of days, it is almost 60 to 70% increase in this industry. And there are so many big giants are merging together. So ultimately, the market is becoming big. Then another important area is the rising manpower. The number of doctors increased from more than 1 billion in 2018 from almost 827 doctors in 2010. So in last couple of years, in last one decade, there is almost a 20% rise in the number of potential the healthcare staffs. And again, from policy perspective, if you see the world's largest government funded healthcare scheme, that is Ayushman Bharat, you already might have heard about the Ayushman Bharat, is launched in September 2018, and since then there is a quite a great number of increase in the total expenditure on the healthcare systems or healthcare related activities. So this was about the whole healthcare industry. Talking about the clinical research. So India is really considered as a great potential market for conducting clinical trials. There are certain advantages, like we have investigators, particularly the investigators, the physician or the surgeons or the doctors who are actually trained in English language. And we can say that more than 600,000 English speaking physicians are available in India who can actually contribute to the clinical research. There are large number of specialists in different therapy segment. You say oncology, you say pediatrician, you say gynec. Everywhere you have a huge number of the specialists available. Uh, then most of them are also have undergone their training from developed countries like Europe or US, and they have really trained well in these clinical trials. Then there is a large number of ICGCP compared investigators on the side, because ICGCP is international guidelines which talks about how the clinical trial need to be conducted so that the data which is being generated to the clinical trial will be accepted by the world or the different pharmaceutical companies or the different regulatory bodies across the world. So we have really good trained manpower in India. So this was about the investigator and this site. And there is again another advantage from the patient perspective. We have large, diverse patient pool, and most of them are not really have undergone any treatment or the recent treatment. So they are therapy now population. There is genetic variation among the population, so you can really find the differences in the treatment in the different genetic variation group of the people. Again, you can see the patient pool in acute as well as chronic disease. Like we talk about in nowadays we are talking about the COVID. So this is a kind of acute condition. We have a large patient in acute condition as well as chronic condition, like say tuberculosis. So we have very large number of the patients pool in India. And finally, the increasing number of patients in lifestyle disorder segment. Then again, HIV, oncology. You will find all the cases in Indian populations. Okay, though it could be a communicable disease, non-communicable disease, as well as some infectious disease. Another advantage is that the clinical research infrastructure, basic infrastructure which is needed for the clinical trials, is the site or the medical colleges. So in India, there are more than 200 medical colleges which produce around 22,000 medical graduates per year. If you go by the government data, there are around 20,000 of tertiary care hospitals and millions of the hospital beds. There are thousands of the test labs and approximately 70,000 scientists and engineers. And important thing is that we have skilled computer savvy biomedical workforce. So these are the basic advantages, but these advantages really attracts the pharmaceutical company or industry sponsored clinical trials. So they come here and they conduct the clinical trials with the very minimum expenses. If you compare the operational expenses of any clinical trial with the Western countries, so we are almost doing in one third price of their Western expenses. Okay, so these are the advantages to conduct clinical trial here in India. But where are we standing in conducting clinical trials. So if you compare the clinical trials across the globe and in India, we will find our share is very limited. So this is another important data which is published on the CTRI that is clinicaltrial.gov. Clinicaltrial.gov is a database, clinical trial registry database, which is maintained by the US agencies, and all the clinical trials generally being conducted in US and out of US are registered in this database. So they have started maintaining this database from 2000 onwards, and if you can see, there are approximately 325,000 clinical trials registered so far. Okay, if you see that in this database, the registration number is increased after 2005 and again in 2008. That is because the International Committee for the Medical Journal Editors, that they have made it mandatory for all the researchers to register this clinical trial for the publication. If the trial is not registered, they won't accept your manuscript for the publication. And there was another FDA AA Act, that is the Food and Drug Administration Amendment Act in 2007, which make all the clinical trial mandatory to register to the clinicaltrial.gov. So if you see this data, I just go to the next slide. The contribution of the India is very, very limited. If you see, uh, the world has registered around 3 lakh 41,000 clinical trials, most of which are registered in US. That's 1.3 lakh, I can say. And India, South Asia contribution is just 5,235, of which India has only registered 4,000 cases. So approximately 1% of the trials are conducted in India. So despite of having all this advantage, large patient pool, good infrastructure, scientists, availability of scientists who are trained in clinical trials, and tech-savvy people, we are actually conducting just 1 or 2% of the clinical trials. And there was always the news in media that we people are being treated as the guinea pig, but that is not a fact, because most of the diseases are present in India, but most of the clinical trials are conducted in such countries where such diseases are not really very prevalent. Okay, so this is the fact, and this data is really kind of mirror to all those people who are deny or saying that the we people are being treated as a guinea pig, but that is not fact. So similarly, like a clinicaltrial.gov, Indian government also has started one registry called a clinical trial registry, that is CTRI, which is being hosted by ICMR, National Institute of Medical Statistics. And as on June 18, 8 June 2020, there were 13,709 studies being registered on the platform. So this number is slightly higher than the clinicaltrial.gov, because the more, in some cases, the studies who are conducted in India are not really registered on the clinicaltrial.gov. And again, the CTRI has made it mandatory for all the clinical trials to register it on the CTRI before they actually initiate the trial. But this number also includes some of the observational trials, not necessarily clinical trials, observational studies, sometimes the dissertation of the masters or PG students, and that's why this number is quite high. Okay, but in reality, the clinical trial number is really limited to 1 or 2% compared to the global. So we can understand our contribution to the clinical trial. Okay, so why there is a so less number? There could be different reasons, but there in last few years there were some challenges faced by the Indian companies, Indian pharma companies, or the pharma companies, because of the regulatory changes, and there were some issues related to regulatory, and that's why the Supreme Court and the regulatory body has to take steps. So particularly in 2011, there was a litigation challenge to the regulatory framework because of patient safety, because there was one trial conducted on HPV vaccine, and there was some safety related issue noticed. So government, the Supreme Court had asked the regulatory bodies to make these changes very stringent, so that all the consent related or safety related parameters could be well taken care by the pharmaceutical company before they conduct the trial. So again, in 2014, India re-established a new guidelines. and there's very focus on the protocol, patient consent, the patient reimbursement. If anything happens to the patient during the phase of the clinical trial, they should get their reimbursement or the compensation, and adverse event management, the medical management of the adverse event or serious adverse event. And they issued a directive that clinical trial could be only be carried out at accredited centers. Okay, so only the centers who are accredited by NABH or NABL laboratories should conduct the clinical trial. But later on, there are again a few more changes. I will come to that point. But this was the scenario in 2014 and 15, and that's why, because of this stringent criteria and the ambiguity in the understanding the rules, the number of the clinical trials were really went down. In, I can say, in 2013-14, only 10 to 13 clinical trials were registered, and that was the really worrisome. Okay, so if you see the regulatory timelines, as you know that in a clinical trial, the drug and cosmetic rules, it's really playing an important role. And in DNC Act, Schedule Y is considered to be a really important because it really prescribes the guidelines for the conduct of the clinical trials and the import of the drugs for the import of the new drugs for the consumption or the testing of the drugs in India. So when Schedule Y was formed in 1988, there was many amendment you can see over the period, but but the important thing happened is in 1997 when ICGCP guideline was introduced, and then later in 2001 CDSO, that is Central Drug Standard Control Organization, also introduced their GCP guideline, which was equally more or less similar with the ICGCP. So this guideline gives us a clear standard for that how to conduct a trial in India. Okay, then the second amendment to Schedule Y was introduced in 2005, and then this second amendment 2005 actually uh, gives the regulatory authority to this CDSO GCP guidelines. So ultimately, the guidelines becomes mandatory. Just to give you idea that all the rules are mandatory and the guidelines are kind of voluntary. So I say GCP's guidelines are voluntary in India, uh, but the Schedule Y or the new drug clinical trial rules are absolutely mandatory. You have to follow it, otherwise you will be punished. So in Amendment 2005, they actually ask all the sponsor or the people who want to conduct a clinical trial to follow the ICH GCP guideline or CDSO GCP guideline, so that it becomes mandatory to follow. Okay, then there were some changes again in 2013. That's what I discussed. But the major change which happened recently is in 2009 or 2019. That is a new drug and clinical trial rule. So it is very important to know what does that prescribe. Okay, so this new drug and clinical trials rule 2019 has been published on 19 March 2019. But before that, they had prepared one draft, and they asked various stakeholders, including pharma company, the NGOs, the other key players, to go through the draft, which was published on. Give me a minute. Can you hear me? Yeah. एकच minute. Just a minute. There is some technical issue, so I will close it in a minute, and then. Okay. So can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's great. Perfect. So into 1st February 2018, they released their draft, and then later on, based on the recommendation or the suggestion from the different stakeholder, they finally released their schedule, the new drug and clinical trial rules on 19 March 2019. So I'll just take you through the Can you just scroll to the next slide?
Sir, access is with you.
No, I cannot access this. I have given access to someone, to
No,
Mataji.
no, sir. Sir, access is with you, sir.
Actually, I cannot scroll it.
Try, sir.
Okay. No. Yeah, but I cannot scroll it. I have I have asked complete, and that is the problem. So can you scroll it, because you are also host,
No,
or
sir, I'm host.
I'll make I'll make you host then again.
Yes, sir. You please stop your sharing screen share. Please stop that screen share option.
Okay.
Just a minute, sir.
Okay, that's better. Next slide. Next, please. Next. Next. Wait. Go back.
Right, sir.
Yes. Yeah, that's fine. So on 19th March 2019, the new drug and clinical trial rules was implemented in India and was effective. So all the trials which are being conducted has to follow these rules, and that is absolutely mandatory for everyone who want to conduct trial in India. Next slide, please. So what does ND CTR 2019 is about? So in this rule, as I mentioned initially, Schedule Y was really giving guidelines or the rules to how to conduct clinical trials, but this ND CTR 2019 replaces the part XA and the Schedule Y of the Drug and Cosmetic Rules 1944. So Schedule Y rule is no more applicable in India. So the commit is that they shall come into the force from the date of their publication in official gazette, except chapter 4, which shall come into force after 180 days. Okay, that means after 6 months of this law became effective, the chapter 4, which talks about the biomedical and health research ethics committee, that should come into the effect. And then they shall apply to the new drugs, investigational new drugs for human use, clinical trial, bioequivalence study, bioavailability, and ethics committee. So for the veterinary product, Schedule Y is still applicable, but this NDCTR rule is applicable for the human use or the clinical trials and ethics committee. So that is the difference, that for veterinary products, still Schedule Y is effective. Next slide, please. So it is important to know the definition of the clinical trial from the regulatory perspective. So if you conduct any investigational or new drug trial, so it has to be systematic a study on a new drug or investigation new drug in human subject to generate data for discovering or verifying its clinical, pharmacological, and pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics activity. It also collect the data about the adverse effect with the objective to determine its safety, efficacy, tolerance, or sometimes immunogenicity of that new drug or investigational drug. So it is basically a systematic study to see whether the drug is safe, effective, efficacious, and can be well tolerated by the human body. Next, please. There are certain new definitions in this new drug and clinical trials rule 2019, and those drugs are newly into these definitions are newly introduced. Earlier, there was a lot of ambiguity and nobody was really able to understand. So these definition, I think it's important to know before we go and see what does this new drug and clinical trials rule talk about. So one important definition they are included is about the orphan drug. Orphan drug is a drug which uh, is intended to treat a condition which affects more than 5 lakh person in India. So if there are some patients which are particularly having a typical size less than 500,000 or 5 lakhs, so what are the drugs we are discovering or we are inventing? So that drug is called as orphan drug. This definition is different in different countries because India has a large population, and considering the incidence rate, we are counted at 500,000 patients in India. If you go to the United States or UK, they have like a 200,000 patient because they have smaller population size. Some drugs which could be considered as orphan drug in India or in UK, but the status is totally different in other countries. For example, this is like tuberculosis or the typhoid, which we have very high prevalence in India, but in UK you'll find a very limited number of typhoid or tuberculosis cases. So uh, why they talk about the orphan drug? Because if the cases of that particular disease is less in any countries, the pharmaceutical companies might not be really interested to invest their money to discover drug. Ultimately, their business will be less. So government has to really look into this and promote the discovery for these orphan conditions or orphan diseases, so that the people can get the access to the new drugs. Okay, so there are certain subsidies, certain discounts, or certain facilities being provided by the government, so that the pharmaceutical company could be interested to develop orphan drugs. There is another important definition they have added is post-trial access. This is important because many times there is a new drug made available to the patient or the participant of the clinical trial, and those drugs are freely available during the phase of the clinical trial. But after the completion of the clinical trial, after subject complete his participation in clinical trial, so those drugs are not available to the participant free of cost. So and if those drugs patient needs those drugs further, so it is important for investigator or the ethics committee to recommend this drug to the patient. Otherwise patient's condition will be worsened or he may die. So in this case, so sponsor has to provide in these drugs so that he can continue with the same similar drug. But the important condition is that the investigator and ethics committee should actually recommend this drug to the patient. Okay, and the important thing here again is that the patient may not get that drug into the commercial market. So it's absolutely important for patient to get this drug from the different sources from the sponsors. So this is a post-trial access. Next, please. Usually, most of the clinical trials are conducted by the sponsor, the industry sponsors. The pharmaceutical company invent the new drug, they develop their protocols, and they manufacture and they taste the drug so that they can get the licensure, so that they can earn the profit. But there are certain other organizations or institutes or investigators who wants to conduct the clinical trial without having any commercial interest or without intending to license that drug into the market. So whatever the data they want to produce is just for the in the interest of the science, or just to support some policy related to that particular drug. So this particular academic clinical trial definition has been recently introduced in this new drug and clinical trial rules, and this gives us a clear idea that on what drug, for how much duration, and who can conduct this academic clinical trials. There are certain privileges being offered to this academic clinical trials, and even some medical institutes or pharmacy institute are really interested in conducting such academic clinical trials. So this is important definition for which is included in NDCT Rule 2019. Next, please. Okay. And though you people know the definition of the new drugs, but it is important to understand it from the regulatory perspective. what does new drug means? If a drug is already is available in the market, and it generally includes all the drug or pharmaceutical ingredients, or even phytopharmaceutical. Phytopharmaceutical means uh, a drug from the herbal origin, or a formulation from the herbal origin, which is having minimum 4 active constituents from the plant origin or any other sources. Okay, from the herbal sources, which has not been used in the country to any significant extent, except in accordance with the provision of the Act and the rules made thereunder. As the conditions specified, the labeling thereof and has not been approved as a safe and efficacious by the central licensing authority. So, if the drug is being newly introduced into the market and not been used significantly, so that is considered as a new drug. So, there are certain criteria. For example, if drug is introduced in the market and there are very limited use of that drug by the different hospitals or the government institute, that could be considered as a new drug. If a drug approved by the central licensing authority for certain claims and proposed to be marketed with modified or new claims, including like a drug is introduced for diabetes, and now it has a new indication to be proven for, let's say, hypertension, or the route of administration is changed. Initially it was oral, now you are going for the aerosol route, and the doses or the dosage forms have been changed. So that is also considered as a new drug. Okay, next please. Again, if there is a combination of the drugs, so the fixed dose combination of 2 or more drugs approved, which are already approved separately by the Indian regulation. So if you are going for the combination in the fixed ratio, that will be also considered as a new drugs. Maybe it is claimed for the same indication or different indication or different route of administration or different dosage forms. Then there is another definition of the new drug, which is very important, that a modified or sustained release form of the drug or novel drug, novel drug delivery system of any drug approved by the CLA. CLA means DCGI or the CDSCO. So if you are going for a new novel drug delivery system, that new drug delivery system will be also considered as a new drug. And particularly a vaccine and rDNA derived products or living modified organisms, monoclonal antibodies, stem cell derived product, gene therapeutic product, or xenografts intended to be used as a new drugs. Particularly, next slide, please. Particularly, as per the definition one, first, second, and third, this drug will be considered as a new drug for minimum 4 years. But for the definition fourth and fifth, that will remain a new drug lifeline, because every time when we are going for the new drug delivery system of the existing drug, it will be considered as a new drug. If you are deriving a new product from biotechnological origin, that will be considered as a new drug. So why I'm talking about the new drug? Because this rule is applicable to the new drugs. Okay, that is a new drug and clinical trials rule. So you have to understand. So for what molecule this drug will be, this rule will be applicable. And there is another terminology called a IND. It's called as investigational new drug. If a drug is being newly synthesized or has been not tested in any other countries and now is being tested on a human being for the first time, that's what we call as IND, or we also call as a new chemical entity. So the guidelines for the IND is slightly different, and for the new drug, it's slightly different. Okay, so it is important to understand which guideline you have to follow when you are conducting clinical trial in India. Perfect. Next slide, please. So what are the key highlights of NDCT 2019? So as I mentioned, this rule was published in March 2019, and particularly the chapter 4 was effective after 6 months of the implementation of this rule, which actually came into effect from the 21st September 2019. So chapter 4 is about the ethics committee for biomedical and health researchers. There are two ethics committee which NDCT prescribed. One is for the clinical trial and another is for the biomedical and health research. And then Rule 97, new rules supersede existing Part XA and Schedule Y of DNC Act. That's what I told in my initial slides. However, all the existing licenses, orders, direction will continue to remain valid. Next slide, please. So in this new drug and clinical trials rules, can you go back to earlier slide? Yeah. Thank you. So in this new drug and clinical trial rules, they have defined the timelines, because initially the biggest challenge to conduct clinical trial in India was the timelines. Regulatory used to take 6 months, 1 year, sometimes 2 years to give you approval to conduct a clinical trials. But this new rules prescribes a specific timelines. For example, if the drug is new drug is being tested for phase 3 or phase 2 trials, so the minimum duration the DCGI or the regulatory body should take is about 19 days. From the time you submit your application, within 19 days, they should give you a decision whether your trials have been accepted or approved or rejected. That's what they have to communicate to the sponsor. And if the trial is on the IND, which has been indigenously invented, for example, if any pharmaceutical company in India invented a new drug, so in that case, the 30 days period is been prescribed. And this is very interesting, because if you apply for the uh, indigenous drug or IND, and you don't hear anything from the DCGI, so after 30 days you can just notify to DCGI, since we didn't hear anything from you, and we are going to we are going to start the trial on the same molecule in the specific format you have to apply. That is what we call as CT4A format. uh, but that even for that matter also, you need to have some ethics committee approval. But it is important because pharmaceutical companies can start their trials without getting trapped into the timelines of the regulatory bodies. Then another important thing they did in this rule is they have increased the fees. Initially, the fees were very nominal, like 50,000 rupees to 90,000 rupees. But now the fees for the phase 1 to phase 4 trial have been increased to 6 to 8 fold. But even uh, the pharmaceutical companies are really happy, because the timeline for the getting approval has been shortened to 19 days. That is at the max. Okay, so the paying fees for a pharmaceutical company was never concerned, but the time was definitely concerned for them. Another important change they made is that the validity of the clinical trial approval is for the 2 year. Initially, it was 1 year. So since the time when your trial has been approved, you can start actually your trial within the 2 years of after approval. So that is important in this city. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are two type of ethics committee been noted in these rules. One is for the clinical trials and BA studies. BA is the bioavailability and bioequivalence studies. And the second is on for the biomedical and health research. Some institute want to conduct their academic studies, academic research, or some surveillance for that matter. Nowadays, many institutes are coming up with the surveillance, so they need not to go to the clinical trial ethics committee. They can go to the biomedical and health research committee. So the clinical trial and the ethics committee for the clinical trials and BAB studies has to be registered with the CDSO, and no studies should be approved if the clinical trial ethics committee is not registered with the CDSO. So there are certain applications, formats, and application guidelines which is become mandatory for all such ethics committee. And then another ethics committee, as I mentioned, that this ethics committee need to be registered with the DHR, that is the Department of Health Research, and for that matter, they have to follow this ICMR biomedical ethical guidelines. Okay, so these are the two different ethics committee in this CTR. The validity of ethics committee registration increased to 5 years. Earlier it was a 3 years. When I'm talking about the ethics committee, I'm talking about the clinical trials ethics committee. Okay, so that has been increased to 5 years. And if there is a decision to be informed about the approval granted by the EC within the 15 working days of the grant of such approvals. So whatever the approval EC committee is giving, they have to notify it to the DCGI. Another change they have made is in case of rejection of the clinical trial application, the applicant may require to reconsider or he can apply to reconsider this application within 60 days period from the date of rejection. For example, if I'm applying and within 19 days I'm supposed to get an answer, but somehow the DCGI reject my application. They said that your study is not valid. They need to be major changes made, or they totally reject your application. So you can again reapply with paying some minimum amount, and then the matter will be forwarded to the apex committee or technical advisory committee, and then they can reconsider your application, and perhaps they can also give you approval after this reconsideration. But this is another provision. This is been made in the NDCTR. So next slide, please. As per these rules, the quarterly report of enrollment status to be submitted to DCGI, 6-monthly status report to be submitted to DCGI from the time the trial has been started. If there is a termination of the trial, the sponsor and the investigator need to notify within the 13 days of the termination of this trial. There is important thing which has been made in this NDCTR is the provision of pre and post submission meeting with DCGI. Many times the pharma company or the investigator, they don't understand how to submit this study, whether it could be considered in the phase 2 or phase 2-3 or phase 3 trial. There are so many queries, and they can really fix a meeting with the DCGI officials by paying a certain amount. And what are the comments, what are the suggestions they receive will be considered as a valid suggestion. I mean, the DCGI will provide them some certain suggestions or certain inputs, so those could be considered during the development of the protocol. And that is really welcomed by the pharmaceutical industries, that pre-submission meeting. And even after post submission, you can go and check what is the current status of your applications. So that is something newly added. Provision of waiver of local clinical trials if drug is approved in certain countries. If the drugs are already approved in certain countries, which is listed in Rule 101, so in that case, you need not to conduct a clinical trial in India. They can directly import the drugs and start using on the patient. But the drug should be available and approved in certain countries. So there are other criteria. The changes in process and requirement for payment of compensation is not made. So what are the changes they have suggested to 2013, 15, they are still valid. And the important thing is the onus of providing medical management to the subject is on the investigator, though the financial matter will be taken care by the sponsor, but actually the medical management decision remains with the investigator who is conducting the clinical trials. Next slide, please. ECI accreditation is not mandatory as per the NDCTR. Initially, they had asked us ECs to register with the NABH. Unless this committee are accredited, they won't be considered them for the renovation of the approval. But now they have removed this clause. So if you want to get accredited, it's voluntary, you can do it, but it's not totally mandatory. The essay reporting criteria has been slightly changed, because initially it was like a 14 days from the occurrence of the event. For example, if any SE or death happen among the participants, so sponsor has to report within 14 days to the DCGI. Means there's a timeline start from the occurrence, but many times sponsor or the investigator don't know if there is any date. Specifically, if it's a field trial, patient is coming once in a month to the site and going back to his home. So many times there is a connectivity issue or lack of communication. So the event come to know after 7 days or 8 days. So that was the criteria. But now the criteria has been changed to 14 days from the awareness. The time from the particular event is made notifiable to the sponsor or the investigator, that is considered as the awareness time. Okay. Then in case of free medical care, PI can decide to continue medical care or until it is decided as not related. Particularly, this is in the case of adverse event or serious adverse event. If there is any event happens, so medical care to the participants should be provided by the study or the sponsor or investigator free of cost. But there is always a clause that if that is found to be related with the drug, then and then only the free medical care to be provided. But many times the causality association between the event and the drug is not proven, or it takes time to get it proved. Or it may take 2 days, 10 days, like that. And during this period, the medical care should be provided by the trial till the time it is proved unrelated. Okay, if it's related, absolutely it has to be provided by the study. Okay. And as I already explained, the condition for post-trial access of study drug to trial participants has been outlined, that if investigator and ethics committee thinks that the patient should get these medicines even after completion of the trial, they can recommend this to the sponsor, and the patient should get that medicine after this trial. So that is something newly added in the NDCTR 2019. Next slide, please. As I was talking about the fees, I mentioned that the fees have been increased from 50,000 to few lakhs, and they have now listed the different amounts for the different phases. If you go by the phase one, the fees is for phase one is 300,000 rupees, phase two 200,000, phase three 200,000, phase four it's again 200,000. If you want to reconsider your application, once it is rejected, you can pay 50,000 rupees and again submit this application, which will be now taken care of by the apex committee. If you want to import the drug, particularly any drugs for the clinical trial, so you can pay 5,000 rupees per drug and import the drugs after having obtaining a licensure. Next slide, please. If your application for the importation of the drug is rejected, you can again reapply by paying 1,000 rupees. And this is important clause, as I was talking about the pre-submission meeting. The fees is like 5 lakh rupees. So if you want to, make some modification in the protocol after discussion with the DCGI, you can fix a meeting, and they will give a suggestion. But the fees is quite high. That is 500,000 rupees. If you want to go for a post-submission meeting, it is 50,000 rupees, and any other application which is not specified about, we can go for the 50,000. Though these fees for seems to be quite high, but these are really important from sponsor perspective because they can save their time and modify the protocol or whatever the study design they get advice from the DCGI. Okay, this is one. Next slide, please. They have put a certain important clause. I was talking about the orphan drugs for the condition where we have less than 500,000 cases in India, and the drugs which are made for those conditions are called orphan drugs. So in this case, DCGI has given clear waiver that no fees shall be chargeable in respect of application for conduct of clinical trial for orphan drugs. Like that, this is kind of subsidy or kind of concession the government is giving. And in case of applications received from the MSME, that is micro, small, medium enterprises firms, for conduct of the clinical trial, approval of new drug, and pre and post submission meeting, and all the applicable fees have been reduced to almost 50%. So they are promoting this MSME so that they can come into this business and conduct more clinical trial or manufacture new drugs or synthesize or discover the new drugs. Next slide, please. So this is the new drug clinical trial rules. We have gone through the important salient features of the NDCTR. There are so many other rules, chapters, sections, but these are the really important one which we should consider. But when you want to apply for the clinical trial, there are certain permissions or approvals are needed. Without that, you cannot really start a clinical trial. Okay, so important approval is from the DCGI approval. Unless you receive the DCGI approval, you cannot really start the clinical trial in India. Depending on the phase you are applying for, you have to apply in that specific format, and they will give you approval. So they have created a new portal called a Sugam portal. Sugam portal is really very friendly and very easy to access. So all the application are supposed to be made online, and they will give you approval online. So it's just a kind of one window where we can put all the documents together, and they will raise a query. We can answer their query on the same platform, and once those queries are answered, they will also give you approval. All the online transaction also happen on the same portal. So that's really very friendly portal, which has been introduced by DCGI in last few years. Then another approval is the IEC or IRB approval, that is Institutional Ethics Committee or Independent Ethics Committee, and IRB, that is Institutional Review Board, which is absolutely mandatory if you want to conduct a clinical trial at one particular site. Okay, so many times DCGI, when you apply for the DCGI, they ask, do you have IEC IRB approval? And based on that, they decide whether your trial could be approved or not. You can always tell them that that application is being submitted and it's underway. So they also can give you conditional approval. Even IRB, IIC also asks whether your trial has been approved by DCGI. You can always say that it's been submitted, and as and when this approval is available, you can notify to IIC, IRB. CTR, as I was talking about, a CTR registration is absolutely mandatory. Before that, your registration, you cannot start enrolling your patient into the trial. And that's really very effective. And they want you to get all the approval, like DCGI approval, IIC approval, HMAC approval, and any other approval when you are registering your trial on the Clinical Trial Registry of India. Another important approval is HMAC approval. That is a Health Ministry and Screening Committee. It is a very high level committee which includes all the members from the scientific background, some financial background, and some other Niti Aayog sometimes. So this HMAC committee is formed by the ICMR. It's a International Health Division in ICMR. They work as a secretariat for this HMAC approval, and this particular approval is required not for all the trials, but if you are conducting a trial with a foreign funding, you are getting some funding from foreign organization, or if you are sending some of the your sample by samples to out of India, like some sputum sample, some blood sample for the testing or quality assurance. So you need to have this HMAC approval in place. Without that, you cannot really get fund inside India, or you cannot send your samples out of India. So that is very important to know. And there are certain other supports which generally are considered very important, like if you have conducted a trial in the government hospital, Ministry of Health support, some scientific bodies like SCMR or CTD, that is Central TB Division, sometimes CSIR. These support are really required so that you can really efficiently implement the trial in that particular area. So these are some approvals and registration required to conduct a clinical trial. I was talking about a clinical trial registration, which I already explained you. This is a clinical trial registry maintained by ICMR's National Institute of Medical Statistics. It's a basically free and online public record for the clinical trials being conducted in India. In fact, not only all the clinical trials, but also some other observational clinical studies are also registered on the same platform. And if you want to, I mean, this is a kind of a good database. If you want to know how many clinical trials in that particular area have been registered in India, or what are the different clinical trials are being conducted in India at this moment, you can go to that platform and put some keywords and get to know. For example, nowadays you are interested to know how many clinical trials been conducted on COVID cases. So you can go and see, and you'll find more than 50 or 100 hundreds of the clinical trials, including modern medicine, reversing of drugs, or Ayurvedic medicine. There could be some observational studies or surveillance studies being conducted on a COVID. So it's very important to get to know. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary to uh, get the CTR registration if you want to publish your data in some reputed journals. So even though if you are conducting some observational study or is a surveillance study, you can register your trial on the CTRI. That will give you extra weightage. Next slide, please. Next, please. I already have talked about the HMAC, and HMAC approval is basically needed for the funding being coming from the foreign organization, and if you want to transport some material out of the India. Next, please. So what we are talking about so far is about the mainly about the industry-sponsored clinical trial. But nowadays, there is a clinical research being conducted in academic institute, uh, like medical colleges or even in some pharmacy colleges as well. And it's important for them to strengthen their capacity, because industry always have their commercial interests. They want to license their drug and get earn a profit. Nothing wrong in that. That's how we get new drugs. But there are certain other information which is equally important. For example, we have conducted some studies on pneumococcal vaccines. For example, the WHO has prescribed the 3 doses of pneumococcal vaccines, and there are big giants like GSK and Pfizer being manufacturing these vaccines, and the cost of vaccine is quite high, like 2,500 rupees per dose. Uh, but we conducted a study, and we try to show that rather than going for the 3 doses of the vaccine, we can also get equal efficacy and equal protection if you give 2 doses of the similar vaccine at different intervals. So this is how we can really support the public health policy makers, and also try to save the cost of the people. Most of the time, these vaccines are being purchased by the government, and the cost is quite high. So if they can reduce at least one dose, the entire cost comes low to the maybe 33% lower than the original cost. So there are different areas where academicians can conduct clinical research just for the interest or policy support and so on. So in India, we are having a very limited role in academic clinical trials. So very limited institutes are conducting academic trials or a research in that than their institute or hospitals. So when we talk about the business in India, we always talk about the advantage. India is free, full of all patient pools, having a high tech savvy people, very good resources, human resources, and all. But when we talk about the clinical research, the real clinical research in academia, as I mentioned, very limited. So what are the barriers, potential barriers in this academic clinical trials? So can you just go to next slide, please? So what are the gaps and barriers? When we actually assess this academic clinical trials, we found that there is a wide variation in funding commitments and sustainability. When we say we want some millions dollars of rupees or $1 million for conducting any clinical trials, we hardly have few $1,000s. And for example, with the money having released for the first year or second year, but third year we don't have the money. So there is a quite a huge variation in funding. There is no proper funding available. The way we have secure funding for the industry sponsored clinical trial, but in academics we have very limited funding, and that's not really sustainable. Again, the allocation of funds and setting up research priority was deemed as disjointed with poor decision making. Uh, the academic clinical trials always are coming with the the different subjects, but that area is not really considered as a thirst area or the area of interest for the many funding agencies. So there is not a clear coordination. Then appraisal of research by policymakers and public awareness of these activities are not sufficient to strengthen the clinical research capacity. What are the data we generate is not really well taken. Okay, the way we when any industry submit any data, so they are really considered as a really good quality data, or they are the policymakers or regulatory takes it very seriously. But the data which we generate as academic institutes sometimes is not really taken to that extent, and based on that, no decision making or the policy changing has been considered. Then again, there is really less awareness among the people. The people feels that the research, the clinical research is being only conducted by the pharma sponsors and not by the academic researchers. So there is not a really great public awareness, so no attraction towards that. Then lack of resources and capacity, including role models, as we never heard that this is a clinical trial scientist, and there is a there are always a limited capacity at the institute when they want to conduct a clinical trials. So there is no clear pathway for the people who want to conduct clinical trial, their career path, there is no support for the new researcher or the budding scientist, so they can come into the clinical trial, academic clinical trial. So that is always a gap. Though we are talking about the English is our language, but when we are actually putting something on the paper, like developing a protocol or developing a design or preparing a reports, we always have certain capacities barriers. So this is something which we always come across when we talk about the academic clinical trials. Next slide, please. So what could be the solution to this? How can we really come forward and tackle this situation? So there are certain efforts being taken, but I just want to highlight here what could be the solution: that development of national clinical trial infrastructure. We can create a national level clinical trial infrastructure that can provide training to the investigator. They can give experience to the clinical trial personnel, so as to develop protocol, uh, and then support them for the regulatory submission, the quality control implementation of the quality control system, data management support, SAE reporting support, etc. And that will be really crucial for such institute to develop capacity in these areas. Okay. There is another thing which can be done is like establishment of the clinical trial network or consortia, which is funded by the government. So all such institutes who have potential, we can come together and form a consortia and do some kind of joint studies as cross-site studies and submit their report to the policymakers like a Niti Aayog or someone. Then there could be a web repository of clinical trial resources would assist the trialists to generate the data. um, I mean, if you have some database, we can give us idea who is the expert in that particular area. For example, if you want to conduct a trial in tuberculosis, who are the different sites, who are the different investigator? Similar for vaccine, who are the people who can really conduct a good quality clinical trials in vaccine, and then accordingly, those could be easily approached. So that kind of a web repository will be definitely helpful. So when I say this, I don't mean that this is not been happening. Next slide, please. So there are some efforts being taken by the government in last 5-6 years. So for example, Department of Biotechnology and Indian Council of Medical Research have now started working towards developing a center of excellence for the clinical research. So for example, here in Pune we have this Came Hospital Research Center, which was recognized as a center of excellence in clinical research by DBT ICMR. There similarly they have identified another 8-10 institute across India. So they provide them funding, they provide them opportunity to come together, brainstorm, conduct a workshop, and develop a proposal. So that kind of the activities could be done, and that's been already initiated by our premium health agencies like a DBT and ICMR. Uh, there could be some career development program led by Indian government so that people can get attracted to the clinical research. And such programs, few of such programs are like DBT Alliance program that is in alliance with the Wellcome Trust. They have now career fellowship in public health. Those who have done their PhD or MD, they can go and apply for this fellowship. They get the funding for as their stipend plus to initiate their own researches. So that kind of fellowship is applied. DBT CDSA had also offered such fellowship as a high caliber investigator fellowship. CDSA is the clinical development service agency, which is providing support to such an institute which has the potential to conduct academic clinical trials or even sponsor clinical trials. So I was the part of this DBT CDSA program as a high caliber investigator in 2017. Then there are certain other programs like Bills and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have developed certain platform like a Prerna platform where they identify a new talent and make them a young investigator, train them so that after 2 years or 3 years they will develop themselves as a principal investigator, and they develop their own trials and conduct more clinical research in India. So these are the few of activities being taken, but again the efforts are too less. We need to really go far in this field, and a lot of efforts, a lot of money need to be pushed into the system so that many clinical researchers will be evolve in next few years. So I want to talk about yes, next slide please. My activities in the clinical trials. I being a WHO fellow in a clinical research, I've been working with in clinical research industry for almost 14 years. I'm also associated with the MSF as a national coordinator. But apart from that, I also work in a clinical research to develop the capacity in low and middle income countries. So now what I'm doing is I'm establishing a network for the developing clinical research facilities in South Asia and Latin America. So we have people in different continents, and then these people are forming a consortia so that we can exchange our knowledge and share our ideas and develop proposals. So this is the basic idea which is being supported by WHO and Gates Foundation. This basically activities for the setting up the clinical trial facilities in low and middle income countries like India. So we'll actually set up this facility across different institute in India. We'll conduct some training programs in clinical research for pharmacy and medical students, and research in LMICs, which I already started. I conducted few programs in International Vaccine Institute, South Korea. I'm also conducting some programs in DY Patil Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences in Pune. And through this program, we'll actually exchange the candidates, the students or the faculties from one institute to another, like some faculties or students from South Asia to Latin America, so that they can know each other and they can develop their skills and knowledge in any particular domain like clinical data management, clinical development, etc. And we are also targeting to write a research proposal and implement those studies in different settings so that we can we can generate a really quality data which could be used by policymakers or the government or any other uh, particular change in policy or implementation of any important decisions. So this is what I have been doing. But overall, we are always talking about the clinical research in respect to the industry sponsored clinical trials, and that is really booming up. Though our contribution is just 2%, I can say, but the commercially we are a very huge market for pharma drug, and that market is really increasing day by day. But there is a definitely need of the scientists who can really identify the good research question, and not those are not really commercially driven, but which will address the unmet public need of the Indian population. So public health is very important, where pharmacy student and medical student can make their career. And this gives us the opportunity to learn much and collaborate with each other, learn during through training programs, exchange of the students, and having some mentorship who can guide our students to develop their career in clinical research is the need of the time. So that pharmacy students who are really who are really expert in the drugs, the formulation of the drugs or the synthesis of the drug, should come forward and take their interests into the clinical research. And there are certain other opportunities also available apart from industry, and we should also know that what are the opportunities available. So this is the end of my presentation. If there is any question, I would be happy to answer. I think I managed to finish within the time, though I exceeded 10 minutes. But that's all. Thank you very much. Any question? Oh, I can see some question on chat box. So can I select, or who will select this? Mm-hmm.
Hello, Bowser ma'am. Hello.
Thank you,
Yes.
sir, for very wonderful session.
Yes.
There are the chat box. I'm not finding the questions.
I can see some comments.
Hello.
So there is one question from Shiva Tushir. Can we register clinical trial of herbal products in CTRI?
Yes, we can definitely register a herbal a clinical trial for the herbal product on CTRI. That's absolutely important. Though rules for the herbal products are slightly different. They have different guidelines from the Ministry of Ayush. But CTRI, as such, there is no restriction. You can definitely that's what I mentioned. You can register your observational studies, your surveillance, your clinical trials, your studies on herbal drugs. So you should register these studies on CTRI.
Malpure, sir.
Hello. Hanif sir,
Yes.
very nice and informative sessions that you can provide for our faculty members as well as the students. I have one question for you. Can a pharmacologist become the investigator or co-investigator of clinical trials?
Okay, that is a very good question. When you say pharmacologist, you said clinical pharmacologist or experimental pharmacologist? I mean, M.Pharm pharmacology or MD pharmacology? MD pharmacology can definitely become investigator. Even I can say M.Pharm pharmacology with the PhD qualification can also become an investigator. But the important criteria here is that all the medical decisions to be taken by the medically qualified doctor. Okay. So as if you refer the ISHGCP, the investigator should be a medically qualified doctor. But sometimes there is a certain clauses. He could be the pharmacist can be a co-investigator, or sub-investigator who can support to the investigator. But the important bottom line is that the medical decisions should be taken by medically qualified doctor who could be like MBBS, MD doctor, or a qualified dentist like a BDS or MDS if the trial is on a dental product. So that is important.
Okay,
I
thank you,
hope
sir.
Okay, one question, sir. Which department of the clinical trials take initiative for the involvement of patients in trials?
Okay. If I understand your question correctly, I said there is no clear department which can take initiative, but generally depending on the criteria, if you want to conduct a trial on OPD patient, you can go to that respective OPD, like a medicine OPD, ortho, gynec OPD. If the patient need to be, the trial is on the hospitalized patient, so you have to go in that particular wards. So as such, there is no department. If you talk about the pharmacy department, pharmacy college, generally pharmacologists are the people who are mainly interested in the clinical trials. So they are always associated with the hospitals and they take interest. Otherwise, as such, there is no clear things that any particular department can take interest in that trial. But so as to conduct a clinical trial on a specific molecule, DCGI always wants that a specialist is available. For example, if you are if I want to conduct a clinical trial on TB, so DCGI expect that the particular investigator is having experience training in the tuberculosis. If a chest medicine person is conducting that trial, that is well appreciated.
Okay, thank you, sir. One question again from chat box. After B pharmacy, how to enter in clinical research? Please, sir, guide me. Ask
Okay.
from Neha Meshram.
Okay. That's what I was telling. If you have completed your B Farm, I mean, you are really in a very good position to be in a clinical trial field. But having some knowledge about the rules, regulation, and systems will be definitely advantageous. So I would suggest if you can take a small course in a clinical research, could be weekend course or correspondence course, which will give you a theoretical base of the clinical trial. Then you can apply for some positions where people, because I also recruit some candidates in my projects, and I always see the patient, not a patient, the candidate is already established his interest in clinical research. And how do I see that interest? Whether he has undertaken some courses or some workshop in the clinical trial. So my clear recommendation will go for some weekend courses or corresponding courses, which give you a theoretical platform or theoretical background, so that you can try in certain pharma companies or investigational sites.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Next question from Shubhangi Pawar, madam. Ma'am, Pawar, madam.
Hello, Pawar madam.
Maybe problem to audio.
Just to add here, there are some online courses which are available free of cost. You can also try those courses, but having courses like a face-to-face courses where there are real good experts who can give you total insight into the clinical trial will be definitely helpful. I mean, we people always see that we want to join industry, but we don't really pay attention to the core, like a clinical trial study designing, the protocol development, data analysis. These are the core areas where our pharmacists can make a career. Not just only about the guidelines or the rules, the monitoring. Beyond that, there is something very important, and there is a huge demand of the resources where people can develop the, design the study, develop the protocol. I think this area who are really interested in clinical trial should always consider when applying for any courses. Otherwise, simply as I mentioned, there are certain online guidelines, online courses available. You can also go through that courses and get a certificate.
Okay,
There
next
is
question
one
is
more
that.
question from Shweta Jadhav. If there is a drug approved, say in US, and it has to be launched here in India, will it be considered as IND in India, or from If so, then from which phase will it start here in India?
Okay, I can see her question. Let me go back to her question. If drug is approved in
US.
US, drug is approved in US. Okay,
Yes.
so when if the drug is approved in any other country, it is not considered as an IND. It will be considered as a new drug. And so as to get into the India, you need to conduct a phase 3 trial, so that after considering that data, Indian regulatory authorities can allow us to launch that drug into the Indian market. That is how it is. Okay. So for IND, the criteria is that the drug should not be approved in any other countries. That should not be tested in any other countries. The drug should be totally new, like a new chemical entity, and that's why you can apply for the IND application. I hope I answer your question.
Thank you, sir. One more question is there. What
Yes.
are the
Next
opportunities?
question is that what is quality of
Yes,
I'm
Palpul is
sorry.
Hi, okay, ma'am.
Yes.
So next question that is what
Yes,
is
ma'am.
quality
Continue.
of life trials? What is quality of life trials? We can say that supportive case trial.
Okay, so there are certain other areas those could be considered under clinical research, not necessarily clinical trials for the drugs or the diagnostic or the devices. The quality of life means that if there is any improvement in this DALI uh, or other activities, the total cost or the lifestyle modification have been increased. So if the drug is likely to improve the quality of that particular patient, maybe slightly, and so there we can consider as the quality of care life or quality of life trials. So these trials are important from the economic perspective. Okay, how many amount we are spending for that disease. If we could just reduce that amount through the new intervention, that could be considered still as an effective intervention. Okay, not necessarily we have having a totally outcome as a cure, but improvement in the health condition in terms of quali and DALI, that will be considered as outcome. Okay, so amount of money we saved and amount of the movements or the lifestyle modification out of that intervention could be improved.
You, sir. Then another question is that what is the role of treatment trial in clinical trials?
So treatment trials are if there is any particular disease, and if you want to cure that disease, so what are the new intervention we are going to test is that we are studying in the treatment trial. So there could be kind of different trials, like a prevention trial. If you're going a vaccine, we are preventing the disease. If you are going for a diagnostic trial for new test on a new drug, new devices, we get to know that there any specific disease existing or any biological parameters have been hampered or changed. So that comes under diagnostic. And treatment is if there is any particular disease existing, whether that particular drugs or any other medicine is able to make a change in the condition of the patient, a clinical condition, or make a change in the biological markers, that could be considered as a treatment trial. So most of the trials are the treatment trials.
Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
very much.
There is one question in chat box, sir. What are the opportunities of MPharm pharmacology person in clinical research?
Okay, I mean the opportunities are definitely good for the MPharm, even for BPharm, but MPharm are preferred because they have the research background. They already have conducted their research topics, and clinical trial is also part of their syllabus. So they are preferred over BPharm. So opportunities are like you can enter into core clinical trials, like monitoring. You can go to the safety surveillance or pharmacovigilance. You can go to medical writing. You can go into regulatory agencies like FDA or CDSCO, and you can also go into the medical services. So nowadays, medical services also considered as one of the very good area where people can make careers. So these are the major areas, but there are so many other areas where you can go. But these are the 5-6 areas like data management, pharmacovigilance, monitoring, medical writing, regulatories, and administration. But as I mentioned, even having just an M.Pharm qualification sometimes won't be really considered. If you can just provide us some certificate through clinical research, like a 6-month certificate or weekend course certificate, that will really show that you are interested in this area. And obviously, you will develop some theoretical knowledge. Yeah.
So one more question: is there any what is the procedure to open our CRO? Is there any legal documentation or?
Yeah, I mean, the CRO you can open, but I would suggest if you, before going for the CRO, you should have some good experience in this field, because there are n number of CRO nowadays, and it's again questionable how much business they are attracting. But the basic thing is that you need to register yourself as a legal entity, like any corporation. You should also have a good staff. You should have a good sites. You should have good contacts, and absolutely you should know the details about the clinical trials, the regulatory procedures, the business models, and etc. So I don't want to say that clinical trial or contract research organization or CRO is not a good opportunity or not a good choice. You can definitely think of CRO, but before that, definitely you should have a really good understanding about the business as well as science of clinical research. Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Bowser, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Sir, anything more you want to add before wrap up?
No, it was a quite a nice audience. I really enjoyed interacting with you people. Nice questions, and I would definitely like to come back if there is any opportunity to interact with more people. Though this was a kind of a very preliminary discussion about the rules, regulation, and current opportunity, but I believe the pharmacy students should go beyond these rules and regulation, and they should come into the core science of the clinical trials. That is the study designing, development of protocol, data analysis, and again report writing. So here they have really huge potential. And I just want to add that the salary part or the total monetary gain is quite high in the clinical trials compared to the other. But you need to have that skills and obviously the interest in this field. So if anybody needs support in this area as a part of WHO, I would definitely available to support them, since I'm working in the clinical research capacity development in India. So you can always write to me, and I shall try to answer as early as possible to any of the questions. And you can share my email ID as well to the participant of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your support, guidance, and very nice presentation. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on the behalf of Matushri College of Pharmacy and the entire fraternity of management here altogether, extend a very heartfelt gratitude to our guest speaker, Dr. Hanif Sheikh sir, for giving such an outstanding presentation, very informative one. I also thank to management MCOP for providing excellent facilities for conducting successful conduction of this webinar. I also wish to express my gratitude to our principal sir for his continuous support, guidance, and motivation. I also thank the coordinators of today's webinar, Mr. Prashant Vyavhare sir, Mr. Sachin Kapse sir, and Mr. Prashant Chauhan sir for their contribution and valuable continuous efforts towards the program. I also thank all the participants, all the academicians across the globe for peacefully attending this session. Once again, I thank you all for your presence. With these words, I seek permission for ending this session. Vivare sir.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Once again.
Thank you very much.
Now I declare the session is over. Thank you.